Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you also for introducing yourselves in the chat. I've really enjoyed reading them and also for filling out the poll. So I'll give just another minute for people to fill that out and then we'll kind of look at it before we begin. But in the meantime, my name is Brennison Wheeler. I use she, her pronouns. And I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator at Women's Advocates, which is a nonprofit organization in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we offer a continuum of safety through our prevention programming, through events like these, emergency shelter, and our aftercare housing support services for victim survivors of domestic violence. A few quick announcements and reminders. I will be sending up a follow-up email with a link to the recording of the webinar and a PDF of the PowerPoint slides. And I'll also send information on how you can request a certificate of attendance. And then before we officially dive into tonight's webinar, I wanted to extend a huge thank you to the friends of the Minneapolis Central Library for making this event happen. I also want to acknowledge and extend gratitude to and for our American Sign Language, or ASL, interpretation services, which are provided by ThinkSelf, Minnesota, Deaf Education and Advocacy's Specialized Interpreting Fellowship Training, or SIFT program. Then just a reminder to you all to click the button above the text box to send your message to all panelists and all attendees so everyone can see your messages. There'll be some opportunity for engagement throughout the webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here and share the results. So it looks like we have a split between 24% reporting that they would describe their mood as sunny, bright, and warm. And then the other 24% said that they would describe their mood as cloudy with a chance of sunshine. So actually, I love that. So feel a little cloudy, but maybe this webinar will prove a little opportunity for some sunshine into your life. I clearly hope that is the case. And then the next question was, would you rather go into the past and meet your ancestors or go into the future and meet your great-great-grandchildren? And then that is exactly 50-50. So 50% of us said they'd rather go back and meet their ancestors, and the other 50% would go in the future and meet their great-great-grandchildren. And I would say I'm kind of split in half too, because I was adopted. So I don't know my biological family. So it would be cool to kind of go back and meet them. But I also resonate with what would the future look like, and what would people further down in the lineage be like. So if I had to pick one, I'd probably say the future. And then the last question was, would you rather have a rewind button or a pause button on your life? And 62% said rewind and 38% said pause. I think pause for me, because I'm such someone who's go, 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 go. And I would love to pause and actually take a moment to relax, sink into whatever is happening around me. And I like to kind of savor those moments, because sometimes I feel like those good moments don't last as long as I would like. But I also understand the rewind. I also kind of am of the belief that everything happens for a reason. So I would think rewinding would mean that you want to go back and do something differently again. And while sometimes, we're not perfect, we'd like to correct our mistakes. I think sometimes things happen as they do for a reason. So that's just my thoughts. You can send your thoughts, justifications in the chat. I'd love to read them. But that is just a fun little poll that we can do at the beginning here. All right. So kind of getting into the topic, we've actually done quite a few boundaries webinars before. So if you've been to any of our boundaries webinars in the past, we had another one exactly titled Let's Talk About Boundaries. We also had exploring your professional and personal boundaries, as well as putting boundaries into action. We've had a lot of different kinds. And so if you are here because you want to continue to think about it, welcome. Thank you for being here. And also, if this is your first one ever, I'm also very glad that you're here. We have found that it's kind of necessary for us to first start with assessing what our current beliefs are about boundary setting, and then work on extending permission to ourselves to set them, because we find that if we try to dive right into what are our personal boundaries, we notice that there are a lot of barriers for especially people in helping roles to feel like they can even set boundaries, or that maybe setting boundaries isn't aligned with their values or other things too. And so kind of creating some space to think about that first, and then diving into examples of different boundaries, what it could sound like, what it could feel like, what those different types are, what the different forms boundaries take. And then we'll end with how to actually set those boundaries and hopefully maintain them as well. And next month for this Empowering You series, the last, almost an episode, like this is a show, the last kind of installment for the webinar series for that will be the power of saying no and how to say it. So that will have even more practical tips for things as well too. So we'll first just start with a few important reminders. So some things that I like to kind of emphasize when we talk about boundaries is I want to acknowledge that you are a unique person with a unique set of identities, experiences, and perspectives, and that those are all extremely valid. And if I say anything during this webinar, if anyone else in the chat says anything that kind of feels like, oh, that doesn't really fit for how I've experienced things, you can let it go, right? Like you can take the things that apply to you in your life and resonate, and then kind of let go of the other things and say, that's not for me, and that's okay. No, no harm done. And then I also wanted to just name that as, a facilitator, a presenter here, I'm here to just provide the information and hold that space for you to also make your own choices that honor you in this moment too, knowing that that can change. So just because during this webinar you thought, oh, this boundary would be really great, and then you try to put it into practice and it seems like, okay, that actually isn't what I want to do, that's perfectly fine. And then again, any examples provided in the webinars are just that. They're just examples. It's not, this is the best way to have a boundary. This is the ideal thing to aim for. Not at all. Just examples that I've thought of. Again, offerings for you to adapt and personalize, or maybe even ignore as you choose. And then again, you get to decide what's okay and what's not okay for you. That's the whole premise of this boundary conversation. You're allowed to change your mind, you're allowed to adapt, you're allowed to learn more information and adjust accordingly. And then discussing boundaries can be challenging for a lot of different reasons, whether it's trauma, whether it's being told that you're selfish if you set boundaries, that can be a huge barrier. It can also feel really foreign if you've never done it before, if it's never been modeled for you in your home and your other relationships at work. It can feel very uncomfortable before it feels like self-preservation. So definitely take care of yourself and do what you need to. Again, it's being recorded, so you can always come back and watch it another time. And then again, reminders about the slides, everything. We also have a lot of handouts, so we're not going to be stopping to do a bunch of like written activities. I've done that in the past. So we're going to keep it focused on a lot of the slide material, but I'll send out those handouts with the follow-up email. So if you are a more structured person, you'd like to print something out, maybe go through step by step. There's also worksheets and things that you can use for that. So lots of other resources. This will definitely not be the end of the conversation, just to start. Okay, so we want to get started with just your association with the word boundaries itself. So there's a lot of different ways you can access contributing to a word cloud. I get a lot of feedback that people really love the word clouds and seeing what other people are saying, and especially in the format of seeing it all at once and seeing the words that are being submitted more frequently become larger and larger. So you can go to menti.com and use the code on the screen. You can also take out your phone or your whatever you have and scan the QR code, and the website will pop up and you can click on it. Or you can go to the chat and click on the link that I just sent in the chat and add up to 10 words that you associate with boundaries. So I'm going to switch my screen so you can see that. All right. So I'm seeing personal space, limits, work-life balance, necessary, uncomfortable, difficult, rules, not right now, adjustable, yeah, permissions, listening to your body, keep away, security, freedom, withstand, balance, my space, steady, protective, my time, my space, freedom, healthy. Right. Privacy, resistance, breaks, love, relationships, personal limits, safe, physical. Yeah. Yeah, lots of different associations that people have. Healing. Feel free to continue to add words to this word cloud as you think of them, but for the interest of time, we will continue with the presentation. Okay, so thank you for participating in that word cloud. This is just a very informal definition of what a boundary could mean. So a boundary could be a limit or space between you and another person, a clear place where you begin and the other person ends. The purpose of setting a healthy boundary is, of course, to protect and take good care of you. And I think that that might be different for some of you, and you can definitely pay attention to your reaction to that definition of that's definitely not what was instilled in me as a kid of what a boundary was. And a lot of people have a lot of like negative associations or negative connotations with even the word boundary, and that it kind of sometimes can become synonymous with disconnection. And this definition really pushes back against that and says, no, the purpose of this is that you actually want to have those deeper relationships and you want to have those deeper connections by being able to honor yourself and protect your energy, protect your time, protect your space. And so, with that, this is kind of the bigger picture of how we can think about boundaries as being situated in a lot of different contexts. So we'll kind of be going back and forth between personal and professional because, we're all holistic human beings. We can't like put one hat on and take it off always. As a whole integrated person, we have all of these different relationships to balance and to consider. And so a lot of our personal relationships, we might focus on this Brené Brown braving model, which is an acronym for boundaries, reliability, accountability. There's a typo there, my apologies. Integrity, non-judgment, and generosity. And that is conceptualized as a lot of the different anatomy of trust. So building trust in a relationship, and boundaries is one of the first things. And Brené Brown's definition of boundaries, what is okay and what's not okay, like very simple. And then thinking about how boundaries are important for providing trauma-informed advocacy or care, depending on what your role is in the community or professionally, being able to think about safety, trustworthiness, collaboration, choice, and empowerment. Boundaries are often something that, in a professional sense, if we're working with victim survivors of domestic violence, is really important to be able to model those healthy boundaries. But it can also be helpful for kind of mitigating those negative impacts of vicarious trauma or being exposed to trauma in other ways or evading burnout. So last I can't even think this month Sorry, earlier this month we had a webinar on when helpers need help, and so we talked a lot about that. We talked a lot about boundaries in that webinar as well too, of how to set them in a workplace and how to kind of shift a culture that allows for that, because a lot of places do not. So lots of other links on the slide to continue to look into. But the first section, again, is to assess our current beliefs about boundary settings and about giving ourselves permission to set those boundaries. So I have another poll for us. And this is multiple choice, so you can select as many as you feel apply to you. So these are statements about boundaries. So I'll give you a chance to read through them, reflect. You don't have to think too hard. You can just say, oh, yep, that's something that I've considered before, and you can click it. And then if there's any others that come to mind too, you can feel free to write those in the chat as well. I'd love to hear about them and see if others have thought of that as well too. It can be helpful to know that we're not alone in the challenges. I'm going to give about 10 more seconds. Okay, I'll go ahead and end it and share the results. So 71% of those who filled out the poll said that a barrier to setting and maintaining boundaries is that they put others first. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And then there's a few ties. Oh, wait. Right after that, 55% of us reported that they fear a disconnection with those who I want to set boundaries with. Yeah, again, that's a huge barrier too, of not wanting to come across as a lot of different things. And it can be difficult to frame boundaries as a way of really valuing the relationship, but we're going to talk about that more further. And then the other most popular one, 43% reported that boundaries were never modeled for me when I was growing up. Yeah, so that idea of it being really strange. How do I have those conversations? What does it look like? It feels different. It feels uncomfortable, unfamiliar. So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to check the chat. Some people are saying sometimes that they're afraid of confrontation and having to deal with others' reactions to their boundaries. Yeah, that's huge. That's a really big one too. And in some of our putting boundaries into action webinar, we go into a little bit more about how to navigate those things of people's reactions, or if people kind of, get that. Oops, sorry, continually violate the boundaries or don't respect them. And then, so I really like what someone said in the chat, saying, here is some growth. I now have some safe relationships that don't evaporate when I set boundaries. Yeah, so there is evidence of a fellow attendee who has been able to set boundaries, and the relationship didn't just dissipate. Great. So here's another tool for kind of assessing your quote unquote readiness for boundary work. So again, no judgment here if you say, hardly true for every single thing. That's just, to bring that into your awareness, to have an understanding at where you're at. And I think it also allows for some grace, right? And some patience with yourself. If you put E for a lot of these things, to not be hard on yourself if you're finding it really difficult to set and maintain boundaries because of kind of the beliefs that you have around them. So I'll read through a few of these, and you can either just think about it in your head. You can, if you're like to write things down, you can write down your responses, whatever you'd like to do, but I'll read through just a few of these. So Here are some beliefs, some belief statements. I have the power to make choices for myself. I am both valuable and imperfect. I am in a lifelong process of growth. My individual significance is not lowered or raised by others' opinions of me. My life is enriched when living in interdependent relationships with cooperative and respectful people. My life is diminished when living in interdependent relationships with uncooperative and disrespectful people. My intrinsic or built-in value is neither more nor less than others. Certain types of contributions will be more esteemed than others in our society or circle, but this does not add to or diminish the significance of my contribution. Others' talents are a pleasure to observe and applaud. I value life and operate from a sense of gratitude, not entitlement. I am able to face challenges and meet problems. I accept and befriend myself. I believe I contribute significantly to the good of others and the world. It is my right and my privilege to own my feelings. Boundaries are necessary and appropriate. Boundaries do not violate love. Setting limits is necessary to keep relationships healthy and vital. And I'm not compelled to justify a boundary with apologetic explanations. I think that's a huge one too that I hear from a lot of folks, is that they will try to set a boundary, but then they try to justify it. They have a really long explanation. They apologize a ton, which again, no judgment towards that, but that can make it a deterrent to want to try to set a boundary if a lot of that is combined with that experience. So just again, some food for thought, some things to think about. So kind of in that same vein, I wanted to quickly talk about agency, because I think that it does a little bit of disservice to just say, oh, okay, here are some boundaries that you can set. Here are some ways you can bring up conversations about boundaries with the people you care about. But if someone doesn't feel this sense of agency, right, that they have this capacity of being able to make decisions, make their own free choices independently and not feel coerced or shamed or pressured or other things, if you don't have that, that's kind of like a prerequisite almost to setting boundaries, is feeling like you even have agency. Because people who kind of threaten someone's sense of security or sense of comfort or freedom to set boundaries typically kind of acts to take away that sense of agency, whether it's intentionally or not. Sometimes they do it without knowing it. So this next poll, and I'll just keep it very quick. So is, have you ever felt a sense of agency, right? So agency being this ability to act independently and make your own free choices about your own life without fear, coercion, or shame in your life before. And again, it's not for judgment or to like expose you or anything, but I think again, it's just more self-awareness and knowledge for ourselves moving forward of if we've never felt agency, or if we've even had it taken away from us, those past experiences, even if we feel like we're in healthier relationships now, can still kind of show up in other ways too. I also saw a recommendation in the chat that if people like to do meditations or anything, or kind of affirmations, they can change those phrases from the last slide into I am formats, and saying them more as a statement rather than a question of if I agree with something or not. I'm seeing that sometimes agency feels context dependent. Absolutely. And I think it's not something that is static, right? It's something that can fluctuate depending on like your mood, depending on your mood, depending on your energy, depending on, you know, the person, the relationship, the context, the setting. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. So 56% said that they currently feel a sense of agency, but they haven't in the past. So that is really common, right? Of right now, I feel secure. I feel like I can make choices for myself. I have some kind of influence over what happens in my life. But in the past, we may not have had that feeling consistently or at any time too. So thank you for sharing that. So this is an activity we've done in previous webinars too that people really enjoyed. And so we've kind of condensed them to 3. But again, you can think of a belief that maybe came to mind during any of those other activities, maybe when we're doing the word cloud. So thinking, or even in the things that you wrote as barriers in the chat. So thinking of this old belief, which often is created by trauma or by unhealthy or uninformed kind of situations or interactions. But over time, someone can really have this core belief that they can really never say no to other people. And thinking, okay, how can I shift that thought? And so a new belief that might be rooted in agency could be, I have a right to say no to others if it is an invasion of my space or a violation of my rights. So I think that might be a little easier for people to think of and start to shift their beliefs toward that instead of blanket statement, I can never say no. This has a little bit more of some qualifications. Another that I hear a lot is it's my duty to hold them together, right? Or, so I can't set boundaries. I can't, limit the time that I spend with family or limit the time. Even if I need to do things to take care of myself, I'll sacrifice that because I need to hold my family, my friends, my workplace, wherever it is together. And then a new belief to kind of think about is I have a right to take care of myself. If they, whoever it is, want to stay together as a family or group, it is up to each individual to make such a decision. We all share responsibility to create the interdependency needed to keep us as a united group. So again, not putting the onus on someone, on one person, on yourself, namely, but being able to say, like, I have this right to be able to take care of myself. And it's that both and, right? That I can still care about my family and still choose to, not go every single Saturday for a family dinner or whatever the case is. So you can kind of figure out what that means for you. And then this last offering is I can never trust anyone again. So that can be something that is a barrier to setting boundaries, or maybe it makes your boundaries really rigid, which we'll talk about in a moment. And you can kind of shift that to, I have a right to take the risk to grow in my relationships with others. If I find my rights are being violated or ignored, I can assertively protect myself to ensure that I'm not hurt. So there's a lot of different ways to think about this. In the past, we've had some attendees who have written a belief that they have a hard time shaking, but they think would be beneficial to reshift. And we've had other attendees in the chat suggest offerings for a new belief that might be rooted in agency. So if anyone thinks of any, you can feel free to send them in the chat, and we'll be happy to brainstorm and think of how we can introduce maybe a new belief. All right. And then this is a little graphic that I made just to extend as a permission slip. If you remember, in school, with permission to go to the bathroom or whatever, you have permission to all of these things. You have permission to say no without feeling guilty. So I saw someone in the chat writing about shame. That's a huge thing. You have a right to be treated with respect. You have permission to make your needs just as important as others, which I remember a high percentage of us said that other people's needs come before our own. You have permission to be accepting of your mistakes and your failures, to not meet others' unreasonable expectations of you, and to let go of the need to maintain the peace or appease, feel responsible for others, which again can be a trauma response too. So again, easier said than done, but this is your official permission slip. So with that, there are some more affirmations. So these are some things that you can repeat to yourself for a bit. I used to write some of these down on a sticky note, put them on my mirror, so I see it when I'm brushing my teeth. I can read it and see it more regularly. And, some can be, I don't need to accept every invitation to an argument. Maybe you have a pattern of, it seems like every time we talk to one person, it ends in an argument. How can you set a boundary? How can you affirm yourself that you can step away. You're allowed to do that. That you don't have to explain every decision that you make. Um, I do what I need to do to keep my light so that I can be a light for those around me. That can be a really helpful one for me too. If you are a little more externally motivated, thinking of that concept of, again, you can't pour from an empty cup, right? So how can I make sure I'm taking care of myself so I can take care of others, if that's something that is helpful for you. There are a lot of other affirmations. So again, you can type some in the chat that are really resonating with you. You can type in your own, you can jot some of these down. Again, you'll have the PowerPoint, so no worries if you don't get all of them down. One that was really hard for me is, I am a giver and I am not above receiving. I honor the balance of give and take in my life. And I think that for me personally, I built up a decent amount of resentment toward like always giving, but I was like, oh, that's just naturally how I am. I'm a giver. Um, and it would feel uncomfortable if someone tried to give things back or say, yeah, you deserve space, you deserve time to relax, you deserve time to yourself. And so I think that that's something to think about too, of that balance of thinking of relationships sometimes as like not that they're transactional, right? They're definitely not transactional, but this idea of it being a bank account. And if someone's constantly withdrawing and never depositing, the balance is going to be negative. And so just kind of thinking of things in that way too, as long as it doesn't feel transactional for you, but just thinking of, okay, it makes sense. Like I'm really depleted. And that's why this relationship isn't feeling like satisfying or fulfilling for me. It feels a little imbalanced. And then lastly, another one that stands out to me is it's okay to say no and feel good about saying it. Again, that guilt piece of what's the point of setting a boundary if then you're spending all the time that's supposed to be for self-preservation kind of beating yourself up for saying no in the first place. So just some food for thought. These are the different forms of boundaries. So boundaries can take up a lot of different shapes, a lot of different appearances. And a lot of us do have boundaries even if we don't recognize it. So while I thought I had no boundaries and I was like, oh, I just do whatever people need me to do, it's fine. But then I realized that a lot of mine may have been like porous boundaries. So I guess still had, like everyone still has boundaries that just fall under different classifications and different forms. So porous would be oversharing or like really having a difficulty of saying no. And something that became really apparent to me in a professional sense and even personal, it mixed in with both of those, is if I don't say no to things, inevitably I'm probably going to let someone down because I'm overworking myself. I'm overextending my time, and something might fall through the cracks because I'm not allowing myself a grace period in between meetings, events, or whatever the case is. And so that can be an example of that porous boundaries, or being really over involved in other people's problems. Again, if you're, oh, I can always go to Bredesen for everything at any time, that is this porous boundary again too of having very loose restrictions and having people having access to you at all times. Rigid boundaries are kind of like on the other side of that, where you don't ask for help, you have very few close relationships, maybe you're very protective, maybe you seem detached, you keep people at a distance, maybe it's because you're trying to avoid rejection. So it could be as simple as like you're at work, someone asks, oh, how's your day? Or like, how was your weekend? And you're like, oh, that's personal. And you don't tell them anything. That could be a very rigid boundary. Not to say that you have to overshare and tell them every vivid detail. Maybe just a simple answer like, yes, like, yeah, how was yours or whatever. Again, that's just an example. Excuse me. And then healthy boundaries. Value your own opinion. That's an example of one. Not compromising values for other people. I think that's a huge one. Kind of appropriate levels of sharing. And again, that's really subjective. I think a big one for healthy boundaries is knowing your personal wants, needs, and being able to communicate them. And when we're in different positions in our life, sometimes we really embody and feel like we are not allowed to have needs. And so even kind of having this, giving ourselves space to like self-monitor and bring awareness to what do I need and how can I communicate that. And even on the other side too, of accepting when other people say no, because then you might be contributing to creating a culture where, you know, everyone has to say yes to everything at every moment. Okay, so this is the second section. So hopefully you are a little more convinced that you could maybe set a boundary. So my first question for this section about exploring what our boundaries are, how can they relate to deepening our relationships with ourselves and others? I'm curious if you've ever tried to set personal boundaries. So whether that's with friends, parents, family members, coworkers, or romantic partners. So again, you'll read these, a lot of these are very similar, but I'll have like, but not this, or whatever the case is. And again, you can write in the chat if none of these options kind of fit. But just curious if people have had experiences, if it went well. We've had a couple people at previous webinars that are like, I'm how many decades old? I've never set a boundary, or I've wanted to set a boundary, but I kind of got really nervous and decided to not follow through with it. Okay, I'll give about 10 more seconds here. I will end the poll, sharing the results. So 30% said, yes, I have set boundaries in my personal relationships, but not my professional relationships. Then right after that, yes, I've set boundaries in my professional relationships, but not my personal. Okay, yeah, so that's fair. And we also have 10% saying that they've never set boundaries with anyone. So just want to acknowledge the variety of experience levels with this and kind of offer a contemplative moment for if you, which category you're in, and maybe thinking why that is. You know, why do I feel very comfortable setting boundaries in my personal relationships but not my professional? Is it because I feel more secure in my relationships with people in my personal realm? Or with professional, is the work culture, you know, fear of being belittled or degraded, or fear of not being held to the same esteem as someone else who's always saying yes? Is it fear of literal job security? Just kind of exploring in your own mind of why you selected the choice that you chose. There's some things in the chat of people sharing that they have healthy boundaries at work and they're successful in setting those. Oh, sorry, the chat is moving, but not so much in the personal life. Recently setting boundaries and others are not used to that and are not respecting the boundaries. Yeah, again, that there can be in that adjustment period. Being not allowed to set boundaries when living with someone who's abusive. Yeah, in the past we've talked about, you know, boundary setting is for when there is not abuse present. So if you try to set boundaries with an abusive person, that could threaten that victim survivor's safety. So that's definitely not a huge recommendation that we're necessarily promoting, but we understand that that can make it really difficult too. Some are also sharing that personal relationships have gone much better than professional. Hasn't always gone well with clients. Yet we have a lot of information in our Putting Boundaries into Action webinar about setting boundaries with clients. Some time boundaries with jobs. Okay, so some people are like familiar with the different types, so we'll get into that in a moment too. Sometimes, yeah, some are also sharing not meeting the standards of the employer, friends, classmates, whoever it is. Saying no feels like I'm sabotaging my change or my chance. I think I'm sabotaging my chance for approval or perfection in certain settings or relationships. Yeah, like if I say no, if I set this boundary, how are others going to perceive me? Is a huge fear too. There's a lot of curiosity of like how people would react if someone says no in a professional setting. That sometimes if a romantic partner doesn't respect boundaries, they leave, which I respect completely. But looking forward to having a partner who respects those boundaries, right, and listens and wants to learn. And a lot of it is learning and cultivating how to interact with each other in a way, and that's kind of what we're communicating with each other. Okay, thank you for sharing. I really like this quote. So it kind of gets at what we were talking about, but boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. So again, I think that helps me a lot too with reframing of it's not a selfish thing, right? It's actually a way for us to maintain a relationship and so that I can take care of myself and also, connect with you. And so that's just one quote that I really enjoy. So these are some personal relationships and professional connections to consider as we get into this next section about identifying our unique boundaries. So describing the different types. So physical boundaries. So again, those are the ones that refer to personal space and physical touch. So maybe knowing what's appropriate, what's not, depending on, again, the setting and the types of relationships. How do you know if a physical boundary is violated? It could be if someone touches you when you don't want them to, or when they invade your personal space. So I think something common, I mean, again, with the pandemic and things, physical boundaries can look different, but because now it might be, maintain 6 feet apart. But pre-pandemic, I know for me, I used to struggle with like not wanting to hug people at work. Like sometimes I would be in a mood to hug people. And other times I just really didn't want to be touched. Maybe I was anxious or something. And I had a hard time um, telling people because a lot of people don't ask, right? They go in for that embrace. And it's hard if you just like stand there like this and your arms are right beside you and you don't reciprocate. But like at that point, you're already very uncomfortable. So even like a way of trying to honor and set the environment to honor your physical boundaries is honoring others too. So even getting in the habit of asking, of like, oh, is it okay if I shake your hand? Or, oh, is it okay if I give you a hug? Things like that. And you can even say, I always sometimes add the caveat of like, it's okay if you don't. So again, that permission, because even if you ask that question, some people might still feel like, oh, this person really wants to hug me, so I need to let them. But actually saying, it's totally fine if you don't. But even sitting, I know like sometimes people would sit like really close to me next, like in meetings, I could like feel them breathing or, just things like that. And you don't want to seem rude and say, hey, can you move away from me? But saying like, hey, I really, value my personal space and I feel most comfortable. Or, again, we'll talk about adding in our values and kind of centering our values and when we're requesting boundaries, but those are some examples. So you can add some in the chat of any that you think of. There's also a question about, are attendees visible? No. So since this is a webinar, the only people that are visible with their mics on and their video on is myself. And then the interpreter is visible, but their mic is off. So no worries, attendees, no one can see you or hear you. So I just wanted to address that. Okay. Next are intellectual boundaries, which I think is a little bit less familiar. I think physical boundaries we may have heard about when we were younger of like, this is my square, no touching like bikini regions or whatever that we teach children of like, there's boundaries to physical space. But I think when we get into the territory of intellectual boundaries, that refers to our own thoughts and our ideas. And so sometimes people violate them if they don't respect someone's thoughts or ideas. So maybe they dismiss your thoughts all the time or they belittle them, things like that. And so I think that's something to consider too. And it gets to this idea of like intellectual and emotional safety, right? Of do I feel safe, comfortable, and at ease to express my opinions, my thoughts, my ideas, or is there an environment where I'm going to be yelled at for expressing my opinion or whatever the case is? And I think setting intellectual boundaries can be a little bit difficult because you don't want to say, hey, if I disagree with you, you're not allowed to say anything mean. You know what I mean? Like it's not that, but it's more so how can we respect each other? And if you feel like you're going to disrespect my intellectual boundaries, maybe don't say anything, right? Like, okay, maybe we need to change the subject, or maybe we need to go into another room or something like that, to kind of preserve the connection or to preserve that sense of safety. And then relatedly, emotional boundaries that refers to feelings, right? So maybe limitations on when to share, when not to share personal information. So example that they provide is gradually sharing personal information during the development of a relationship, as opposed to revealing everything to everyone. Yeah. So emotional boundaries can be violated when someone, again, criticizes, belittles, or invalidates another person's feelings. So not just like a thought that they have, but being able to feel like you can express and emote yourself without being shamed. Um, yeah. So that, again, you can think about that and think of what that means for you in your life. Here's some others. So sexual boundaries. So again, I think that's one that doesn't get discussed enough. But all of these different aspects of sexuality. So again, it can be emotional, intellectual, and physical aspects of sexuality. So it's not just solely physical. So again, these boundaries could mean having a mutual understanding and respect of these limitations and desires. Again, that can be violated with unwanted sexual touch, maybe pressure to engage, leering, or sexual comments, other things too of, this is my boundary, this is my limitation. Having those conversations can be really important too. And the material boundaries, so again, that can be money, possessions, other things too, can be violated in more overt ways, like someone stealing or damaging something. It can also be a little more conniving, a little more manipulative, of being pressured to be given or lend or loaned, different possessions or things that you have. It could also be like material boundaries, could also mean like on a professional setting, like making sure you're asking before you're borrowing like office supplies or other things too. So just different things like how can I show respect for this person's belongings. And then time boundaries are huge too. So a person can set enough time for the various facets of their life. Time boundaries are violated when another person demands too much of one another's time. And I think those come up a lot, right? And it can be really difficult to set those time boundaries because our needs can fluctuate and change. And maybe one week, yeah, we want to spend a lot of time with it, with, your parent or your whoever. And then the next week you have more things to do for work or external obligations and things like that. So that might shift and say, okay, my time boundary, like this week, I'm going to have less time for these things. We can definitely plan on, having a night where we cook dinner together, but the rest of the nights I'll need to have for myself, things like that. But I think work can also demand a lot of other people's time. And I think we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. So I'll save that for another time. There's also digital, so that wasn't included on that. So I think that's a huge one too. Of digital boundaries can refer to things like, it's important for me to connect with you, but I have this boundary of maybe only connecting with you on the phone every other day for 30 minutes, not every single day for an hour, different things like that. So these are different examples, and you'll see that each of the examples have a value assigned. So in that handout worksheet that I'll send out later, there's a values activity of like circling your top values and then using those as a guide for when you're forming and thinking about your boundaries. So again, you can, and that can help, I think, people who are newer to boundaries of saying, oh yeah, this is aligned with my value, and this is why. So it doesn't seem arbitrary, like I'm just making up random rules for how people can interact with me. It really is just coming from a place of that self-preservation and self-awareness. So knowing that, you know, be like kindness and being inquisitive is a huge value of mine. So I would really want to encourage others to refrain from shutting down or dismissing my thoughts. Right. So like I would like to know more about why you think that. So these quotes, like those things could be an example of someone respecting that intellectual boundary. So instead of saying, oh, that's so stupid, how could you think that? I don't agree with that at all. They can say, I'd like to learn more about that. And you can say, the reason I would like you to ask me that is because I value receiving kindness and feeling like you are interested in knowing more about my thoughts. So yeah, you can kind of read through these. Another could be balance is a value. So saying, for digital, I may not respond to everything you send me right away. Maybe please don't text me throughout the entirety of the day, just different things like that. And again, you can phrase it, make it your own, you can personalize it. So just thinking of what your different values are and how they align with the boundaries that you want to set. And the purpose and the function of that boundary is, again, to be able to feel more connected to yourself and to other people. Okay. And then, so more on those values. So these are some things for work-specific ones too. And so I invite you, if you'd like to, in the chat, write down what your values are. And so these are different, like, if I value this, here's a boundary that I might set. So privacy might say, please do not comment or ask about my medical history at work. It's invasive and I feel uncomfortable. Or anti-racism, if that's a value of yours. If a client or a coworker says something racist or acts in a way that perpetuates racism, saying the boundary is, I will make it known that those words and behaviors are unacceptable, and I ask that they stop. So that's a boundary that I have, and that can be intellectual, or however you want to categorize it. So I'll give a moment if people do. So I'm seeing in the chat that consent is a huge value, autonomy, safety, and respect. There's another comment in the chat that not to make light of those hurt by COVID, but it has been wonderful for personal space boundaries. It's helped me feel more confident about letting people know they're in my space. Yeah, I think that, again, not always needing to silver line a pandemic, but if there have been a lot of positive experiences, and I've definitely heard things for those physical boundaries too, of how did I let people, like random people in the grocery store, like breathe on me, or like lots of different things too, of opening us up to the ability to kind of speak up for ourselves, even if it did start out in the name of public health. Others are sending in their values, saying self-respect, respect for others, feeling safe enough to remove myself from any situation that I feel uncomfortable in is a value. Safety. So safety boundary, maybe a physical boundary with a dating partner could be not telling my date where I live until there's a reasonable trust. Yeah, that makes sense. That's a very clear connection of like, I value my safety, therefore here's my boundary. Thank you. Okay, so the next poll we have is about work. So the question is, do you feel pressured to answer work-related emails or calls after you've clocked out? So there's a lot of different options here. So give a moment for that. We have 30 more seconds. Wide variety of responses so far. I like in the chat someone is saying, asking people to accept your first answer. Yeah, I like that one because I think people do ask, multiple times until they get the answer that they want and not changing it and saying, hey, this was my first response. Personal pressure to get more done for clients. Yeah. Some people are sharing that they're in the military, so there's not even a such thing as clocking out. Yeah, someone's sharing that they don't have a job because they're a teenager. Thank you for being here. But needing to set boundaries in their relationships, but feeling pressured to find a job to justify um, themselves to other adults in their life. Yeah. And sometimes struggling to set those boundaries in our personal relationships can show up at work too. So being able to develop those skills early on can be helpful for implementing them when you do have a job. Sometimes people are saying, wow, sorry. Um, Someone in the chat is saying that most of the time they can totally be done after clocking out, but sometimes things come up, and in certain roles, maybe being a manager, they feel obligated to handle things. Yeah. So I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll. So, and a tie between three different options. So 26% said, yes, I feel pressured to always be on call and ready to answer regardless of the time. Another 26% said, I don't feel pressured necessarily, but I do find myself working a lot after I believe I should have stopped. And then another 26% said, I don't feel pressured to answer, but I feel guilty if I don't. Yeah, so a lot of that is kind of speaking to this idea of always on call, right? So, and again, this is not a self-blame thing of to say, oh, why am I like this? I suck. But maybe evaluating the culture at work. Do the supervisors, do the other people that you work with expect that constant availability? And then is that unavailability perceived as lack of care? And again, I think that perception results in a lot of us doing that over justification and apologizing. Even if it's, sorry, like I had a close family member pass away. Like I've definitely like interacted with other coworkers who have felt so guilty for even going to a funeral or celebration of life, and how that is problematic in my opinion. Of workplaces should acknowledge you as a dynamic, holistic human being with different needs, and always on call culture can compromise that ability to be recognized and respected as that human with all those different needs. It can also discourage advocates or workers or whomever, wherever you work, from developing hobbies and skills unrelated to work too. Which those things can be really helpful for life satisfaction. And then overinvestment and over-identification, that can also contribute to distorted boundaries. It can contribute to burnout, compassion fatigue, all of those different things too. And so we have some suggestions for how to establish new norms. So leading by example with clients and coworkers. So again, you can say, okay, well, I don't really like that everyone, feels bad. I'm going to non-apologetically say that I'm going on PTO and I don't have to explain myself, or I'm going to celebrate when my coworkers, take their birthday off and spend time with their friends and family. Again, that permanent change can require everyone's buy-in most of the time. Just having a couple people who value balance might not be enough to create an entire cultural shift at your organization. I think also creating a shared definition of emergency can be really helpful. So saying that, I do give you permission to contact me after hours if this, and that. So like in a shelter setting, it might be, right, like a life-threatening situation for a resident or other things like that. But to another person, emergency could be, oh, there's a deadline and I want you to work on it now, but not much work can be done at 11 p.m. So maybe it's something that could wait and not be deemed an emergency. So however you want to think of it, but just saying, okay, what will constitute an emergency? And if it doesn't fall into that category, it can probably wait till the next workday. Push back as a group on unreasonable demands or expectations. So those are ways to kind of address those things in the workplace too. And then lastly, transitioning out of work mode. So that is something that can be really difficult, is to be able to leave work at work, right? And so I think that's one thing that actually the pandemic has made a little bit difficult for those who are working at home. And I know I've experienced that myself too, where I kind of just felt like I was always at work. You know, my desk was always right there. I was always answering emails. I was always answering calls. I was always working on a project. So being able to have these physical transitions or rituals to help train our bodies and condition our bodies to say, okay, now I'm in work mode versus now I'm in any other mode that's not work mode. So it could be, you know, changing into different clothes. It could be, you know, closing our laptop and saying, I'm not going to open it again until 7 a.m. next morning or whenever. It could also be going for a short walk. So maybe if you're used to commuting, even going out to maybe walking to your car even, or walking around the block, and then saying, okay, the second I step back into my home, I'm not working. Maybe you have, you know, a phrase that you repeat to yourself about letting go of the day. Maybe do a breathing exercise. Maybe you have an after work snack or a beverage or something to kind of indicate to your mind, okay, transitioning into whatever your name is, mode of, like, you know, Brenison's mode of relaxation or spending time with family, whatever the case is. So you can send what other things you might do for transitioning. Yeah, some people are also reiterating that it's difficult when you're working from home to separate the two. Okay, so this is another quote. As we are working toward setting boundaries. So sometimes when we're setting boundaries and we're working on maintaining them, we might encounter some reactions that are quite negative, that are, how dare you not allow yourself to be accessible to me 24/7? How dare you? And I try to repeat this quote in my head whenever things like that might happen, of the only people who get upset about you setting boundaries are the ones who are benefiting from you having none. And so I remember, like, every time I read that, it still is kind of like a little hit to the gut of, like, it really gets me to the core of, wow, that is so true. And I don't allow myself to think that way. And it can be helpful to think about that, of like, what are they benefiting from me having no boundaries? And how can we actually have a connection where it's not reliant on me dropping anything at any time, or, you know, them saying jump and I say how high. So I also wanted to put a reminder that while boundaries are often promoted as preventative tools, it is never your fault if someone else chooses to harm you, right? So boundaries can be helpful for creating a conducive environment for interactions rooted in shared power, power with, so not power over, but power with, and also kindness. But again, boundaries can be scary to implement if you don't have that safe environment. And again, if people react negatively, you setting a boundary, it's not, the thought might go to saying, you know, oh, it's my fault, but I shouldn't have tried to have personal agency and tried to think that I could set this boundary. But instead, reminding yourself, I have a right to being able to set these boundaries. And if people violate them, then I get to make a decision of how I want to move forward. But I am worthy and deserving of respect. Okay, so the last section is about how to actually set these boundaries with people in our personal lives and how to maintain them. So these are some of the, like, kind of basic steps overall. Again, they look very easy, but they're harder to do in practice. So there'll be some things we'll talk about and break them down. But again, awareness is key, to being able to take those steps forward, is knowing what are my desired boundaries. So giving myself that space, and then being able to communicate what I need. Again, making sure I'm doing this in a way that is simple. I'm not over explaining. And again, there might be an adjustment period. And like, oh, okay, Brennison's never set boundaries before, but I respect it. I respect her, and I respect, her decisions. Maybe setting outcomes. So again, like saying why it's important, of like, if this boundary is respected, then X, Y, Z. If it's not, then it might cause me to feel this way, or whatever the case is. So again, it's not, and being careful of not like threatening it. So sometimes I know like abusive people could use boundaries, like could be controlling and do it under the guise of boundaries. But a true boundary is not a power play, right? It's not rooted in power and control. It's rooted again in that self-preservation and respect. And then being consistent. So enforcing those boundaries firmly and fairly every time, again, while still recognizing that you're human. And if you find yourself constantly even like saying, oh, I know I said that was my boundary, but it's okay, we can forget about it this time. If you find yourself doing that again and again, it might be an indicator to you that you need to modify that boundary, because it's actually not something that's serving you. Okay. So here are communicating your boundaries. Before we dive into all of the content on the screen, we have one last, no, sorry, 2 more polls. This is the second to last poll. So again, lots of different choices. I tried to encompass a lot of different ways that people would feel about this question, but the question is, what is your confidence level in starting conversations about what boundaries you need in your personal and professional relationships? So again, I'll give them a minute or two for you to read those answers and select the one that you think best applies to you right now. Give a few more seconds. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. So let's see. 31% of those who responded to the poll said, I feel somewhat confident in starting conversations about boundaries in my personal relationships only. And then right after that was 21% that said, I feel somewhat confident in starting conversations about boundaries in my professional relationships only. Yeah. And there's a handful of people who selected the other options as well too. So I think that's also good to just, again, bring to your awareness of what your confidence level is right now, and think, okay, I want to increase my confidence level, or, how am I going to interact now that I have made that assessment? So these are different ways of communicating our boundaries. So I think that one of the first steps is kind of assessing what is the effective method. And again, really thinking about your relationship with that person. I know in my own life that it's really hard to communicate things like that in person. It's hard to communicate over the phone with some people. So I know just based on my relationships with others that sometimes things can get misconstrued or confusing over text. So for a certain person, it might be more helpful to say, hey, let's grab a coffee. I want to talk to you about some things. Or maybe it's the opposite, where text is, a place where it feels a little more comfortable for some people, maybe. I know there's some relationships I have in my life where I think for some reason seeing it written down helps more than just, being able to forget something that someone said in passing or whatever the case is. So again, it can also be a combination. So once you figured out, okay, what the actual method is, you can start small. So you can mention things that bother you in the moment. So if someone does something, and it can sometimes it's after the fact, like after something, sometimes we don't realize a boundary has been crossed until it's been violated already. So kind of saying, oh, I did not like the way that felt, or when you said that, it made me feel this way. Can we think of a different, could we have said that in a different way, or whatever the case is? Maybe casually bringing up things that you value or that are important to feel close to another person. So again, you don't even have to say the word boundary. You can just say, hey, like, what are your values, or what are things that are important to you to feel close to others? And you can bring up, oh, for me, to feel close to someone, it's really important for me to feel comfortable, like saying no to them, or, being able to say, okay, I know we said we were going to spend time together until 9 p.m. Oh, am I frozen? Oh, am I back? Okay. I saw the interpreter froze for a second. Frozen, and now I'm back. Okay. Thank you. So I think the last thing I was saying was, oh, it's important being able to communicate. Oh, something that's important to me is to feel comfortable expressing my needs or expressing how I'm feeling. So maybe it's saying, oh, we agreed that we'd spend time together until 9 p.m., but it's actually 8 p.m. and I'm really tired and I value our friendship. So I want to make sure that I'm paying attention to you. And right now I feel like I can't dedicate the energy to you that I would like to. So I'm gonna go home. Maybe telling that person about other times when people in your life did or did not respect your boundaries. So sometimes not to talk about others in that way, but just to provide examples can be a gateway to kind of opening up that conversation for you and that other person. Um, and then sharing what setting boundaries means to you and how having them makes you feel. So again, it can be difficult to interact with other people's conceptions and understandings of boundaries. No. Hi. That is so strange. That has never happened to me before. Okay. Um, it seems like the recording is still going. So we'll continue. I think we lost about half of our attendees. Can you hear me? Can't hear me. Oh no. Okay. 1 second. Hello? Hmm. Can you hear me now? I tested my mic. It says it's working. You can't hear me. Okay.